Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Many of you have been there before. You're not there now. You're actually in my dining room. But you have an opportunity to join us for our third and final Michelle Smith Lecture for the year 2020. We began this series years ago with the support of the Robert H. and Clarice Smith Foundation. We began it this year in February with a talk from Jonathan Horn on Washington's retirements. We were joined post-closure and from our homes by Dr. Edward Larson on Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. And today, this evening, we get to talk about the most important moment in the lifetime of George Washington, and some would argue one of the most important moments in world history, the American Revolution, with Dr. Timothy Breen. But before we begin that conversation, I want to thank you for being here. Many of you are subscribers to this Michelle Smith Lecture Series this year. You all will have received a signed copy of this book, signed by Dr. Breen. But also many of you are not subscribers and are joining us from your homes, many of you around the country and even beyond our national borders. We're thrilled to have you with us, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Mount Vernon soon. My thanks go on behalf not only of the library and the team that's put this together. Dr. Jim Ambuske, our director for the Center for Digital History, has been essential in creating so much of this programming that we have. But I also want to thank you on behalf of the most important organization in Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which rescued Mount Vernon from certain ruin in the 1850s and have preserved it and continue to protect it through today in this current crisis and in this current challenge. They've been through difficult times in the past, and they are stewarding one of the most important historic sites in our nation up through and into this new century and in this new challenge. So thank you on behalf of Mount Vernon, of the library, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. I want to mention a couple of things that we have coming just around the corner, because we're coming up on an important holiday weekend, and we have a series of events beginning on Monday, and I'll talk to you about Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. On Memorial Day itself, we have a member-exclusive event. So for those of you who are members of Mount Vernon, will be able to join Dr. Doug Bradburn, our president and CEO, in conversation with Rick Atkinson, author of the first book of a trilogy on the American Revolutionary War. They'll be coming to you at 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday evening, in our regular book series, Dr. Jim Ambuske will be in conversation with Harvard professor Vincent Brown on his new book on one of the most important slave rebellions of the 18th century, Tacky's Revolt in the Caribbean. On Wednesday night, and this is a bonus event. We don't normally have Wednesday night events, but Wednesday night we'll have a special book conversation with 3 authors of a book, as well as General John Kelly, who will also be joining us for that conversation, moderated by Mary Catherine Ham. This is a book about people who have lost loved ones in war, in this case, 3 women who have lost their spouses in war in recent years. These are Gold Star families. You'll often hear that phrase. This will be a book about their experiences, about the challenges that they faced, and their path to the present. And we're excited about this event. We are happy to be able to hold this on Memorial Day week, and a great opportunity to talk about really some of the real effects of war, both past and present. But today, we have a great opportunity again to dive into one of the most important historical events. Certainly, the founding moment in our nation's history is a revolution that we still try to understand and we still grapple with. We try to come to terms with what exactly this revolution was all about. And to help us do that tonight, we have Dr. Timothy Breen, who comes to us. He's been a professor for years at Northwestern University. He's coming to us, I believe, from Vermont. Am I getting that right, Dr.
Northern
Breen?
Vermont, almost to Canada.
Thank you so much for joining us from near the border. Dr. Breen is the author of many important books and articles on the American Revolution, most of which you read if you go through graduate school, as I did. And my first introduction to Dr. Breen's work was a little article called The Baubles of Britain, or something similar to that, that was then turned into an important book, The Marketplace of Revolution. But here tonight, I'm excited to dive into your latest attempt to grapple with the American Revolution. And I want to ask you, just as a way to get started, What led you to write this book? And the book that I'm talking about is called The Will of the People, The Revolutionary Birth of America. You've written about the American Revolution in the past. What did you feel you needed to say today?
Well, first, let me just say, Kevin, how much I admire your library and your own work. It's a terrific center, and scholars like myself would have been hard-pressed to write the books you just mentioned without the tremendous work at Mount Vernon. So thank you. The American Revolution has inspired many excellent books, as you apparently read in graduate school. But the history of ordinary people, men and women, for the 8 years of war has not been covered. It's a topic that has demanded attention. Other revolutions, if you study France or Ireland or Russia, there's always a book about how did the people endure? How did they get through? How did they sustain the revolution? But in fact, actually, in our own revolution, that subject has gone missing, partly because we have a concentration of attention on the lives and the intellectual life of a few people known as the Founding Fathers who guided us through this difficult period. So I felt that there was a topic hiding in plain sight, as it were, of how people negotiated and made sense of an event that transformed their lives as well as the nation's future.
It's a remarkable way to think about it. How did the people endure? We often describe the American Revolution, and I know people that write about the war often have to remind people that this was a difficult war, right? They often have to remind people that this was not some sort of gallant and fairly bloodless, relatively bloodless war compared to so many in world history. They need that reminder. But you're making a point that's even broader than the war effort itself, broader than the battlefield. What do you mean when you say, how did the people endure? What sort of challenges would the American people across the 13 colonies have been facing in their own daily lives during the war years?
Right. Well, it's a very fine question. We do have military histories, and frankly, with all due respect to your friend George Washington, military histories kind of not the happiest story all the time. There are a lot of losses or whatnot. We have intellectual histories, which turned the revolution into some fine principles, abstract principles, but they kind of are timeless. And so it occurred to me in my own research over the years that revolutions have their own cycle, almost an emotional cycle. At the beginning of the war, there was a period of excitement, but people, many of whom would go on to be soldiers, needed assurance that, in fact, the cause was good. It takes, as your military historians say, it's very difficult to go into battle. You see things and you endure things that are unthinkable. And so young men on the eve of the revolution actually turned to their ministers for a message of assurance. This turns away from high intellectual history to sort of explaining revolution on the ground in your own communities. Right. But then in the early years of the war, another emotional phase occurred, Kevin, and that was living with fear, because suddenly in your own community, the enemy might have been your neighbor. You look like you, and there's no dress of Tories, but violence was everywhere. And so in the first years of war, the major adjustment that American people had to do was just living with fear. And again, if you look at other revolutions like France, fear is a central word, but frankly, I was one of the first to really bring this forward. And then there were other phases. We're going to talk about a phase of betrayal when you discover that the people you think were your allies, your fellow revolutionaries, aren't there anymore, or they turn on you. And then there's the greatest of all temptations when a war is over, of seeking revenge. And it takes an extraordinary power to not in fact sustain the carnage, because you yourself have gone through such the time. So there's these emotional phases. So it gives a kind of a temporal movement of our revolution. Most stories, frankly, jump almost like bullfrogs from Bunker Hill to the Declaration of Independence to maybe a couple of battles, and then whoops, the war is over and we're on to the Constitution. I'm exaggerating, but the force, the energy at the community level necessary to sustain the war was a story that I try to tell. And let me even make that more strongly if I can. Yeah. If communities had not stepped up time and time again to sustain the war, to sustain the commitment to a revolutionary cause, independence, and the creation of a Republican government, we would not have won the war. The missing piece of success is us, people in little churches and in little communities and crossroads that decided that even in the greatest news of adversity, that they were going to sustain the cause, and they did. That's what that's the message I try to give.
That's fascinating. And one of the, I've asked a couple of questions. One of the things I want to remind our listeners or viewers is that you have the opportunity to ask questions to Dr. Breen. So please be posting your comments or posting your questions in the comments functions that you see in front of you on Facebook or YouTube or wherever. Post questions. We'll about halfway through our hour together. So here in just about 20 minutes, we'll start going to audience questions, and I look forward to that. But let me stay on this. You mentioned different emotional registers at different periods across the war. When we come to say, well, let's just kind of hone in on something like 1776, 1777, as you mentioned the sort of early heyday, the early flurry of excitement. When does that first challenge of can the American people sustain the revolutionary effort, when does it begin to appear in your research? Does it happen in 1776?
No, 1776 is still the time of the, a lot of excitement and probably false beliefs that maybe because of Bunker Hill and that the Americans can win. But the retaking of New York City at the end of 1776 alerted people that they were in for a tough fight and a long haul. And when I say tough fight, I don't mean just battlefields. I mean expenditures of war, sustaining the men and the boys that are going off from your town. That means clothes and food and sacrifice that affects entire families. And so in 1777, people began to realize they had a problem, and one of the problems that I talk about is a chapter on revolutionary justice, because it's in this period that communities need to identify and to protect themselves from encroachment by internal or domestic enemies. And so there's a kind of an unofficial community justice that's enforced, trials and semi-institutional courts. I ask a question that many legal historians found it hard to answer, but the law had to go forward. In other words, if you had a problem in your community, say a cow got on to Kevin's farm and ate his corn and various other things are more serious, you can't really tell the fellow person, look, I'm sorry about the cow, but let's wait until there's peace. Let's wait until the war's over and we'll settle, because none of us know how long. The point is that a process of adjudication primarily focused on revolutionary ideology sustained the war in 1777 and up until 1778. 1778, a new set of issues connected with inflation and economic suffering entered a phase that came very close to undermining the entire revolutionary cause. I think many of your listeners who think of the revolution as a kind of a lockstep towards freedom and us and all good things do not realize how perilous the cause was towards the end of the war. people could have decided that they made a big mistake, that maybe being with England wasn't worth the suffering. They didn't make that decision, but it held the situation held in a perilous balance.
That's fascinating. One of the things that in our conversation before we came onto the air, and in my own reading, is that chapter that you described briefly with the appearance of massive inflation. I wonder if you could set the stage for this document that we'll talk about shortly, that you see on your screen in front of you, The Downfall of Justice. I wonder if you could set the stage for what you mean by an economic crisis and inflation. How bad was it? What was going on in the late 1770s?
Well, certainly in very late 1778, 79, and 80, conditions of hyperinflation entered the war conversation. The Continental Congress had issued really millions of dollars of unsecured currency. They had to do it. It seems like a mistake, but they had no alternative, but it was unsecured. And it quickly lost value, and very quickly the ratio of the face value of a currency was 40 to 1. And people on fixed incomes, people who had marginal incomes, were badly hit by inflation. And as you know from your own reading of history and the people that are listening, hyperinflation can really bring down a regime. We've seen that in a number of countries, in Argentina and others, where hyperinflation can destabilize politics in a dangerous way. And so the Congress tried to persuade people to take the currency, making the assumption that you were doing it for the revolution, but in fact people were suffering. And I point out in the book that these communities from Williamsburg all the way up to New Hampshire made a surprising decision. They could have turned on Congress. They'd say, you know, our leaders are just not up to it. They're responsible for. That's not what happened, Kevin. What happened was, in fact, in community after community, people did try to find or to define for themselves who was responsible, who was hurting us economically, who was the bad guy. And they came to the conclusion throughout America that the enemy was us. It was fellow revolutionaries, not Tories, not British agents, but fellow Americans who were using the war for profiteering, for extortion, for monopolizing goods, for playing the prices to maximize their own income, while people in their communities around them were suffering, especially families that had sent soldiers to war on fixed income contracts. And so there was a rising animosity to the people that claimed that they were patriots, but in fact were self-serving people. Now, these images that are flashing on the line here, we want to keep this one for a second. That's, I think the audience will identify the fellow on the far left. That is Mr. Satan, and he's looking at a group of extortioners. These are people that are buying goods, holding them back, and then trying to sell them at a high price, even though they know there's great need out there. This was it's a little play about a obnoxious, self-serving family. It's called The Downfall of Justice. A farmer returns on Thanksgiving Day, and he and his really disgusting family sit around and make fun of the poor Americans who are begging while the rich farmer has goods. This little play was published in Danvers, Massachusetts, right at the very, very last days of 1778. And it's very rare. There are only 2 copies that come. This one comes from the Huntington Library. But it graphically brings forward the disappointment and anger that people felt at the betrayal within their own midst. And you can see that with this kind of emotional sensitivity, why the issue of sustaining a revolution is important for us to come. I mean, people who were very, very unhappy might have turned to other options than simply becoming the US of A.
So obviously, well, this person dealt with the experience of feeling betrayed by his fellow countrymen by writing a play. What did other Americans do?
I'm sure I interrupted. Why don't we move up a slide here, or an image? There. I realize that it's very faded, but you just have to take my word for it that what we're seeing is expressions of discontent and anger. These are Continental soldiers who've been sent off from a town, and they're wondering why they're not getting their pay, or why their pay isn't sustaining them in food and clothes. And at the end of this little play, again, it's called The Downfall of Justice, the major figure says, reminds readers or viewers, I think readers mostly, that when soldiers become very, very unhappy, they sometimes turn their arms on their own people rather than on the enemy. And while that seems unthinkable in our American Revolution, in fact, we see the factual basis that these kinds of thought were happening. If the government and the whole system of the economy wasn't supporting these guys in the front, then what's the point? Would be what the play asks. We now know what these communities did to these extortioners and these speculators, or the dreaded word, the monopolists. You know, all these economic terms that, frankly, if you follow the stock market, might be familiar, but that's another story. But the towns did what will strike any economist watching us tonight as a totally irrational and certainly ignorant response. And that is, they decided to deal with hyperinflation on the community level by setting prices and setting wages at the level of the start of the war. And so town after town sat around. You can imagine how these committees, it must have been incredibly boring. I'd sit there in Newburyport or Salem, and I'd say, Kevin, do you remember what wheat cost in 1774? How about going to the tavern? Remember we used to have a beer? How much did that cost? And so here we see from Newburyport the extraordinary detail, wheat, rye, shingles, oats, hours and hours of research into price trends and labor trends. We can move up a slide and see some of these other towns' reaction. Here's Ipswich for the prevention of monopoly and oppression. They're not talking about the revolution for independence. They're not talking about Ipswich, let's beat the British Army. They're talking about people in their midst who they feel have betrayed the cause and need to be reminded about economic justice. No, let's move up another one. Another slide. Well, keep going. We can see this is but this is my favorite one. Salem. I mean, it was even the people that put together these economic reports complain because, in fact, prices moved even as they were setting them. But my favorite one is funeral directors and grave diggers. So the committee they said, well, you know, that's probably 3 shillings, maybe 3.5 shillings that's the price. And then somebody, you can imagine meeting, said, well, wait a minute. What if a small person dies? What if a child dies? That's not as much work as if a big guy dies. So they said, oh yeah, that's right. Maybe we should have half price. So the incredible detail of public life becomes the language of revolutionary. In other words, to sustain the revolution, you're worried about how much a beer was supposed to cost. Now,
and they did it in formal ways. I'm seeing all kinds of signs in what you're posting here of committees and selectmen. So they're going through the processes of the law, it sounds like.
Well,
as they make
they're going through committees. The committees are generally elected, and indeed, what sustained the revolutionary governments was, for the most part, town committees, self-constituted. That's why the book is called The Will of the People. The revolution is being worked out and defined and given meaning at this level. Now it would be very tempting to say, what a foolish act. You know, the people of Salem can fool around with prices of gravediggers, but I'm sorry, inflation is more complicated. It has to do with loans in Holland. It has to do with international currency exchange and all that. But that is not my point. My point is that at a very, very tough time in the revolution, thousands of ordinary citizens, not soldiers, not founding fathers, are coming forward and participating in a revolutionary challenge. It was an act that reinforced commitment. It was a public meeting that sustained a cause that could have gone very, very bad. And so I refuse to ridicule them for their economic foolishness, but rather see this as an absolute vital moment of reconstituting the enthusiasm for independence.
So is this your answer then to why that classic historiographical question of why the American Revolution doesn't take the same course as, say, the French Revolution? Is this where you find the answer there? It's in this community level of engagement?
That is certainly one, although I'm sure that was true of many revolutions in Katie. The comparative history can take us only so far. There was not an embedded, hated priest caste. There weren't an aristocracy that had lorded over the folks of Massachusetts. It was a more egalitarian society. And it may have been that egalitarian spirit coupled with a dedication to a rule of law. Very few, almost none of these committees ever engaged in physical torture or misuse of power in order to achieve their ends. And even people that were in fact branded as gross exploiters oftentimes were either exposed to the public in a sense of ritual shame or given a small fine. It was more the process of announcing what justice in a revolution movement should be that we should, I think, our attention. My point about the comparativeness of the revolution is that many of the questions we would ask of other countries have not been asked of us. But then you go on and you say, well, let's take a point, Kevin. Look at the French Revolution. After the terror, it led to the Directory and then finally settled down into a dictatorship under Napoleon. Our revolution ended. There was a peace treaty. People who had suffered horribly, seen their family murdered, had their farms burned out, terrible things. And yet they were willing to pretty much let it go. And so it is remarkable. I'm not sure I answered it fully, but 1784 or 85, the run up the Constitution, could have been a story of unaccommodated rebels, people that still wanted to carry on vigilante, taking to the hills of Ohio. Could have happened. It happened in France with the Vendée, but it didn't happen here. And that is something I find remarkable about our revolutionary story.
It absolutely is. And one of the ways that at Mount Vernon that we, and obviously I think, well, there's truth in both visions that we're about to describe here, but you're describing a from the bottom up way in which the American Revolution settled into something like a peaceful and Republican world. At Mount Vernon, we often look to George Washington as having played a key role there. That is, he could have taken more power than he did. He provided the sort of unifying influence that the revolution needed and a stabilizing one. But I wonder if you could speak to how do you bring some of the great figures, the George Washingtons in particular, into this this much larger story that you describe in your book?
Right. As you know well, I wrote a whole book about George Washington. I'm very, very fond of him, as I've told anybody that will be patient enough to listen to me, that the more I studied George Washington, the more I came to respect him as a person for his integrity and his honesty, and mostly for his Republican sense that this was a government of the people, and he would not become Napoleon. He would not become Oliver Cromwell. And that's good. Look, we know quite enough about the founding fathers. We seem obsessed by them. We know what they ate, how they loved, how they cheated, how they whatever. And we probably know more about John Adams's mealtime than we do about revolutionary committees that actually sustained the war. It's not that I reject the founding father narratives. It's just that I think that we should, as I said earlier, realize that without the folks in the situations I talk about, all the founding fathers would have been just an elite book group, perhaps at a university, talking about Harrington or other topics, and we would have still been singing "God Save the Queen" in America.
I wonder if you could say a word. I'm sure a lot of people, as you describe the American concerted effort to see through the cause, have thought about those Americans that actually didn't, right? The Loyalists. I wonder if you could say a word. What did you learn in writing this book that helped you understand those who never did come into the fold, or maybe those who did find a way to move from initially supporting the revolutionary cause to resisting it? What can you tell us about the Loyalists in this equation?
Well, the Loyalists, for many reasons, were outmaneuvered very quickly early in the revolution by revolutionary committees that filled the gap where the downfall of British rule. And in as early as 1774 and 75, dissent was very difficult. The revolutionaries had taken over basically the enforcement of revolution. We would call it ideological control. I might say, and the Tories suffered. They complained about free speech, and one of the things I try to remind my readers is obvious. Anybody that watches television today, world news, is revolutionary change, regime change, major political alterations are messy, angry, violent businesses. And there has been an effort, I think, over the years to rather sanitize our revolution, remove things like fear, remove things about domestic violence, as if we could just simply follow Washington and the founding fathers right up to the Constitution without worrying about all that bloody, nasty business that foreigners engage in. But in fact, our revolution had some bad moments. There's no question. I don't see how it could have been any other way and succeeded. People who study the Tories often feel that they were done by, and they have a good point. Nevertheless, on these communities, in the communities, and they're seeking for justice in a number of ways, they did maintain control. I might, if I may, just say one other point, because I know we're going to go to a comment time. The big point of the book, if I may say, is that the revolution did not start as a revolution. Nobody in 1774 or 75, instead of maybe a few extremists, wanted an independent country, certainly hadn't thought about a republic. They wanted the British to reform the empire, to be fair, to give them trade acts, to stop taxing them. That was all the goal. And then gradually they found themselves drawn into violent confrontation. And many people at the community level came forward. Men, it was mostly men, all men actually, at the community level, who took positions of responsibility that they had never had before. These were new men. These were politically new men. And they were making decisions about their neighbors. They were making decisions about the boys that were being sent off. They took control. They were living, Kevin. They found themselves living republicanism. They hadn't set out that way.
Yeah.
But the experience of running a revolution, the experience of getting through 8 years of war, turned our revolution into a real revolution. It became a republic through the experiential moment of actually doing revolution.
Outstanding. Thank you. It's an exciting story to tell. Even no matter how many times we talk about the American Revolution, there's new ways to think about what came of it and where it came from. Let's go to audience questions, because I think we have a good number of them to explore. We have a question from Breen about autonomous communities, especially those in New England. So these towns that you've studied closely, Dr. Breen. How did they come to support the national project, potentially at the peril of their local independence? So this is it's a big question, how it is that people in small communities that maybe never traveled more than 40 miles from their home came to think about a new nation. What could you say to answer Brent's question?
Well, Brent, that's the tension between local communities and the Continental Congress was real. You have to remember the Congress was pretty weak and unable. In fact, it could hardly find a place to meet. Sometimes it became a kind of a road show. The major document that I would point you to was passed by the First Continental Congress in October of 1774, and it's called the Association. And the 11th chapter of the Association recognizes the independence and the independent procedures allowed by communities by saying that all of the boycotts and the control or the policing of trade would be ceded to these committees that were self-elected. In other words, the Congress is saying to the communities, we recognize that's where the action's going to be. And once they had made this decision, of course, these communities throughout, especially New England, but there were also New Jersey and Maryland and Virginia, took on ever greater activities. Within months, it was no longer a question of tea. It was a question about getting gunpowder and arms and basically running things. When you challenge one of these committees, which happened from time to time, they turned table and said, what? We're only doing what Congress told us to do, and that's run the revolution.
Wow, so Congress actually made that first gesture to bring in the
I think and Bryn can go, I think the Association is one of the absolute most important documents that allowed our revolution to go forward with community backing and participation.
Thank you. Thanks, Bryn. We have another question coming in also from Adam, asking about how does your argument square? How do you reconcile your argument with the experience of the Continental Army at Valley Forge and elsewhere, where local communities preferred to trade with the British, who had solid money, who had specie? What can you say to that? Obviously, that need for hard currency led some people to seek it where they could find it, which may have been from British sources. What can you say to answer Adam's question?
Well, revolutionary Americans being human beings, you're going to get some folks that you can trust and behave themselves and some that do not. And the clandestine trade with the British in the Delmar Peninsula was especially bad, sometimes along the Virginia coast, where people desperate for hard currency would trade farm goods and meat to British, oftentimes British ships. And this was an issue of enforcement. And in my chapter on revolutionary justice, I'll show how quickly and forcefully these enforcement committees address the system, address the abuse of trade. Obviously, there was contraband, but it had to be a stop. It was also true in the New Jersey, Manhattan frontier. There was a lot of trade that went back and forth. But again, both the Continental Army and these local committees did a fairly good job of policing the situation.
Fascinating. We have another question that it's going to ask us to explore not those who sided with the American Revolutionary cause or those who maybe resisted it, but those who just kind of tried to stand in the middle. So I wonder if you could talk about if there's any way to estimate a percentage of the population that was neutral or tried to just stay out of it entirely, and how were they treated?
Yeah, well, this is fun. I gave a lecture in Boston where I was asked this, and I gave what I thought was a good answer, and someone came up from the audience with actually some knowledge and corrected me. But there's a very famous quotation that appears in almost every textbook. It comes from John Adams, where he allegedly said that 1/3 were supported the revolution, 1/3 were thoroughly against it, and 1/3 wanted to remain neutral. And that's what I told the people in Boston. And because I'm such a careful scholar, they all nodded their heads. But this woman came up, and she actually works with the Adams papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, like your place, a great institution, and said, you know, Adams, when he said that, wasn't referring to the American Revolution at all. He was referring to the French Revolution. That's where the quotation comes from.
Wow.
So, so the 1/3 that we all quote is at best irrelevant. My feeling to the questioner is that these committees, and there were thousands of them, enforced and policed the revolution so thoroughly that they outmaneuvered opposition so thoroughly that it became very difficult in town after town to express an alternative view. Again, these Loyalists and Tories probably suffered. If I might give you a quick example, if I may. In Connecticut, they had a lot of problem with raiders, British raiders and Loyalists coming over from Long Island and attacking little towns for cattle, for food. And so the Connecticut legislature said, well, look, what we're going to do is every town will form a list of suspicious people. We don't know, but they're not like us. They're probably closet Tories. And so whenever there's a raid, and we can't catch them because they grab cows and sheep and run so fast, we'll assess the damage and then charge it off to the local people who are suspicious. That's the way you enforce a revolution.
Yeah. Wow. It's one of the things that our next question brings out is something that I know you write about in the book, and I'm curious to explore it, is the ways that women were playing roles here that helped to shape the course of the revolution. You've talked a lot about men who maybe were members of these committees, but women also had roles to play in helping to enforce or to project a particular vision. What can you say about the role of non-elite women during the war years?
Sure, and that's fair. I mean, and because we often tries to seize upon elite cases, elite women. There's endless quotations from Abigail Adams as if she was the only woman that lived at this time. But in fact, war is disruptive of families. In an earlier book called The Marketplace of Revolution, I have a visible proof list of women in Massachusetts who signed their names to public protests or signed their name to support the boycott of tea and other goods. Signing your name on a public document is an act of courage, actually. And as we all know, signing petitions makes your inner feelings public, and yet women were coming forward and actually making a political statement. And in the towns, there was during the war, a good deal of support for and by the women. As the federal government or the national government proved unable to fully supply the troops, as the earlier questioner at Valley Forge, the towns often took over the supplying of their own troops in shirts and blankets and whatnot. Also, the towns, I found, although this is something I wasn't able to pursue as much as I would have liked, recognized that women and children whose husbands were fighting were in peril economically, and often created a kind of a network to support these women, the female patriots. I might say one other last element, because I think your question is very, very salient. In New York, I found a lot of cases where New York State passed a law that said that if the husband ran away to New York and was clearly an agent for the British, farms could be taken over by the state. They could become public property. And the Albany courts was besieged by a number of women who said, well, look, I can understand the law, but my husband, I never agreed with him. You know, he had a lot of crazy political ideas, and I think you should let me keep my farm, because I mean, otherwise, I mean, I wouldn't follow him to New York. And generally, the Albany courts sided with women and recognized that they were able to hold and articulate clear differences, in this case, support of the revolution, and not be a threat to the mission of independence.
That's a to break. That's a remarkable outcome. We have another question that has me thinking. I actually have not thought along these lines. So this question asks whether the way that the English in the past had handled rebellions, so we might be talking about the Jacobites or even before, affected how Americans went about the war after Lexington and Concord. For example, how Jacobite soldiers were treated after the final defeat in 45, I believe. What can you say about any American thinking along the lines of past English behavior regarding rebellions?
Well, that's also an insightful question. It's hard to answer. The Irish case, when I've been writing lately about Ireland myself. Breen is an Irish name. Some people will recognize it. When the Irish rose up, which they did often and never successfully, the put down was often really brutal, really terrible. Think of Cromwell in the during the 1650s or 40s. In Ireland, the Jacobite revolution or rising was put down also fairly brutally. In America, the situation was a little different. It was 3,000 miles away, and the logistics of supporting the war and supporting the troops were very different. And there was recognition that supply lines, especially food, would have to come from the war zone itself. I mean, there was a continuous effort, usually unsuccessful, to try to win back the Americans in some way. And a part of it was just a recognition that, as we in this country discovered in the war in Vietnam, that a war at a huge distance requires different logistics and tactics. And so the comparisons with Ireland and Scotland go a little the way, but not too far in an interesting comparative way.
Fascinating. There's a moment in the slideshow that you had where you talked about the danger of soldiers actually sort of taking the revolution into their own hands. And of course, we have a moment that we talk about quite a bit at Mount Vernon. It's one that every student of American history has explored a bit, and that is the potential conspiracy towards the end of the war to unsettle Congress in favor of supporting the troops. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to Cynthia Miller's question about the Newburgh Conspiracy, George Washington's role in addressing the troops. This seems like a moment that touches on that again, the way the revolution could have turned out quite differently.
Yeah, I agree with you folks down in Mount Vernon. I think possibly Newburgh, Washington's handling the Newburgh Conspiracy may have been his most noble moment. He used his full force of personality and charisma to head off a really quite threatening situation. I don't cover the mutinies of the Pennsylvania line and several other lines at the end of the war because it did not directly well up from the community level. It was among the soldiers themselves that felt that they were being done by, and they were not being paid. They were not being treated with respect. Again, in every revolution, the folks that probably suffered the most are the troops, the privates, the grunts that actually carried on the action, who find themselves easily cast aside, and people all turn to the leaders and say, "Thank you for doing all that good work." So all I can say is that the mutinies and the lines was a very serious business, and Washington's little speech about becoming blind in the service of the country may be one of the most important one-liners in our history.
That's right. That's right. Actually, at another institution just up the road at the Society of the Cincinnati Anderson House, in their library there, Ellen Clark, their librarian, was showing me a document they have where George Washington was purchasing a pair of eyeglasses just before this speech, this famous moment where he put on his glasses. And it's a really remarkable moment. You can actually see described there. Of course, we don't have the glasses. We don't know exactly which pair he would have been wearing, but we have a letter where he was purchasing these glasses that then became one of the great props in American history because he was able to use them to such theatrical effect.
Well, I love those moments myself, and I've spent some time at the new Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, where they have some extraordinary artifacts, including a piece of the bridge at Concord and things you just can't imagine survive, but there they are. Washington's greatness to me was his integrity, and at every level, he loved stuff. He loved to buy stuff. He liked the latest things. He would have liked the country magazine, telling you how you entertain this or that lord. He loved that stuff. But when it came to boycotts and actually sacrificing his personal comfort for the good of the country, he stepped away. And I might say that many Americans did that at a time when today, if I may, that we're asked to think of the larger common good of protecting our neighbors and protecting ourselves. But there's always a few people that think that liberty means doing whatever you want at the expense of the rest of us. They wouldn't take much comfort from the ability of the American Revolution to mount very successful boycotts in the name of a common cause, of foregoing some of the items they most dearly love. Tea. I mean, taking away tea then would be maybe a quick equivalent to taking away your iPad. I mean, it's unthinkable, but they did, because they recognized that this was the only community activity that could be monitored and might have leverage over the British market. So we should take, I think, some inspiration from the founding people as well as the founding father about guiding us in times of great peril.
I completely agree. It's an interesting parallel to explore too. We also have a question coming in about the experience of war, and it's certainly the starting premise is certainly a true one, that we often find ourselves today feeling as if war is a far and distant thing. How would you describe the experience of these people? Not the soldiers. Let's leave them out for a minute, but the people north and south in the American revolutionary years and their experience of the war itself. How did the war come home?
Well, most of the committees, most of the communities I write about, and this was one of the points, did not experience the face of battle. I mean, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, there were some battles in Rhode Island, but largely New England was not a battle zone, and the war moved south and various other places. But the point was that without the threat of an army marching through your state, how do you sustain the excitement? If you're not threatened, you might say, well, let the next state handle. There was a little of that, but by and large, the treatment that, I mean, is the questioner must know that in terms of the dead or the killed in war and the revolution compared to the total population, it was one of the most lethal wars in American history. I mean, only exceeded, of course, always by the Civil War. But many of these young men died far away. And increasingly, as historical archaeologists are finding actually mass graves in places in New York area along the Hudson, where they had central organizing areas and ammunition dumps. And there's been a large fight recently in one of those New York towns where somebody wants to build some commercial enterprise on the site of a revolutionary grave, or many graves. I hope they don't make it. Nobody asked me, but the respect for the Revolutionary War dead has probably not been as great as in other wars, because people scattered. It was such a scattered instance, and you go to any graveyard in New England, including Vermont, and you'll be surprised how many tombstones you'll find with recognition of service in the Continental Army.
Wow. Let's we're coming into the home stretch, and I want to find a way to cram in 2 more questions before we let you go, Dr. Breen. We have a question now about it's actually a great one that I used to ask my students all the time as they were starting a project and they were diving in, is what surprised you? When you have an opportunity to dive into any historical field, what stood out to you as a surprise? And for you, it's a particularly fascinating question because you've been studying this period for so long. What surprised you about the colonists' ways of viewing the world, the ways of viewing the common cause in your research for this latest book?
Well, any good research project is Kevin and any historian knows, is research is always an act of serendipity. You find things you didn't expect. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's research is fun. Writing's not so much fun, but research is. And I think the largest surprise I had in writing the chapters on fear, consider when a society becomes afraid. Germany in the 1930s, England during Cromwell's period, that people do some really bad things. They do some terrible things, and they often spend the post-war years apologizing or trying to erase what they have done. And during this betrayal period and during the revenge period, the American people could have, and I think we probably would have tried to understand, killed neighbors, engaged in torture, of vigilante activity on a large scale. And my surprise was how many times in all the states I studied, people under tremendous stress tried as best they could to obey or to sustain something that we would recognize as a rule of law, as something like due process, of something like representation. I was surprised because towns, for instance, in northern New York, up around Albany, west of Albany, it was dangerous. There were a lot of fighting and really nasty warfare. And yet these committees, time and time again, would try to get witnesses and evidence. And you wonder, how could they do this? They're in the midst, they might get killed. And yet Americans, and this is my surprise, at every moment pulled back from vicious extremism.
Remarkable. The last question may well be the biggest question of all for someone who's explored so much. Is how has your understanding of the revolution changed over the course of your career? And I don't want you to talk about the breadth of the ways it's evolved, but maybe if you could pick a theme or something singular that has evolved in your own understanding of the American Revolution.
Well, it has been a long process, and I appreciate the recognition of some of these books that I've written, probably because of my background and my family's background. I've always been gravitated towards the understanding of how people on the ground react to perceptions of the abuse of power, whether it's corporate power, political power. The people have found ways to negotiate and react and control the threat. And in my book, Marketplace of Revolution, I tried to trace how people use the common marketplace to express a shared sense of what they thought the empire should look like. And in my other books, but even the Washington book, I praise Washington for being entirely in touch with this American strand. I don't know of any leader other than Washington that so fully understood what it meant to have a republic based on the will of the people. We talk about that theoretically, and we have great texts that go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. But to actually see it on the ground working is very difficult. And so I'll praise Mr. Butterfield and Mount Vernon by saying that the perfect marriage of the revolution was a great people's leader and a lot of people that supported him.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Dr. Breen, thank you so much for joining us for an hour this evening.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm so glad. This is, again, our third and final Michelle Smith lecture for 2020. We're excited to welcome you all back into Mount Vernon, or at least as close as we can at the moment, for a conversation like this. You also have an opportunity to buy Dr. Breen's book, and you can, I promise you, learn a great deal from reading this new work, as well as, I think, see some contemporary relevance in ways in which the meaning of what it is to be an American, I think, is well described here from the very founding. So thank you, Dr. Breen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. We have plenty on store coming around the corner starting next week. Every day at noon, we have live streams. Mount Vernon is trying to stay connected with you while the gates are closed. But please continue to support Mount Vernon, even in this time when you can't come visit us in person. There's a link here, a way to donate and support the institution. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Dr. Breen, and thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you all.
I was really surprised at how dark